All right, so here we have a user service server that is exposing this endpoint API, this web service endpoint /API/user, which is returning this data that is represented in this array. That when we access it through an API, we as /API/user, right? It runs this find all users, and then it just returns the list of users as an array. And there it is. Okay. Let's look at being able to parse for a particular user, right, that has a particular ID. So to do that, let's implement here app.get that receives API/user and then the user ID. Notice that I've prepended the this string with a colon. If it were no colon, then it would be a literal string, right? It would be actually /user/user ID literally, right? By putting a colon means that this is not literally user ID, but it's a placeholder, and whatever I put after the /user, it will be mapped to this variable, right? So that I can retrieve it later on and parse it from the URL. Okay, so the use case here would be that we are trying to find a user by its ID, right? And then we're going to implement it right here as function find user by ID. And here's the request and response. So what I'd like to be able to do is get a hold of that user ID, right? So that I can then maybe iterate over some array and look it up. Or next week or the week after, when we look at database, we would like to query the database for that particular user ID. Okay. So first of all, we'll need to retrieve that. So to do that, the request object has the capability of parsing through that parameter. So because all this data is coming from the user, right, from the client. The client is providing all this data. It's part of the URL that is coming from the client. So all that is represented inside of the request object. Okay. In this case, it's found in the params map, right? Any parameter that is in the part of the URL will be mapped in the params map, right? And we can retrieve it by its name, user ID. It maps it and using the variable name that we gave it here, and we can store it in a local variable user ID. Okay, these don't have to match. Right? It's just this is a local variable where I'm storing that value. Yes? Now that I have it, I'd like to be able to iterate over that user ID and then return just that one user. Right? The problem is that users is being declared here in some other function. So what we could do is just move this variable for user out of here and just put it in a higher scope here, right? So that it can be seen by all functions. Right? Now we have the user ID. We can iterate over all these users. We can say var user, it will be users.find function user, and I'll return the user whose ID matches the user ID. Right? And once we find that user, we're just going to return that user. We're going to return it response.send back the user. Yes? Right? Once we found it. And notice that this code is exactly or almost identical or very similar to what we did on the client. Right? It's almost identical to what we did on the client. The only difference here is that we're not saying return, right? Because there's nowhere to return. Right? We are participating in a request response lifecycle. Right? And our only return is to go back to the client with data. Right? Our only way out of here. So there we go. So we have that. Let's restart the server. And if we now say /user123, ideally comes back with just Alice, right? Or we can just return just Bob or Charlie. See that? Right, just with the ID returns that one particular object. Make sense? Right, again, next week we'll move all this data to the database. What I'd like to point out is that what if I move this Notice that the hello still works. If I say hello, notice that still comes back with this hard-coded string down below here, right? This hello from user. But notice that if I move this, the order here, if I move this up here, right? Notice that if I restart, okay, and this still works, right? So 1, 2, 3 still returns just Alice, and 2, 3, 4, right? But if I say hello, notice that it doesn't return anything, right? So what happened here is that this first URL pattern is more general than this URL, right? This is just one special case of this one above, right? This one is just this one whose user ID is hello, right? So this one obfuscates this later one over here, right? So what the mechanism is that these are all these URLs, right? They're all listed by configuration in the get, and it'll run through all the URLs, so comparing them to all the patterns. The first pattern that matches, it'll stop comparing any of the other patterns, right? So if this one matches, if /user/hello matches this pattern, it will stop trying to match with anything further. That makes sense, right? So if you have specific patterns you want to match first, you should put them first, right? So you should put any specific pattern first, and then put more generic patterns later. Make sense? All right. All right, great. So we already implemented find all users and find user by ID. All right. Now there's a couple of other ones that we want to find users by username and find users by username and password. Yes. And the way we're going to implement them is to use URL patterns, URL queries to search for them, right? URL queries. Yes? So let's take a look at how to implement that next.